Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the classic original 62 book series. And it's book number 34, Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. Oh boy. To begin, I remember reading this book as a kid. And when I was a kid, I thought this book was kind of fun. I haven't, gotten to the episode just yet, but most of my fond memories come from watching the episode as a kid. And I had this episode recorded on a VHS that it was actually my friend's recording. And when he knew that I liked Goosebumps, it was his older sister's tape. He let me have it. So this was like an episode I got to watch a lot as a kid, next to the home release VHS tape. So I'm well acquainted with the episode. In the book, I would read from time to time, but I never thought it was as good as the episode. And it still rings true as an adult. If not, this book, reading it this time around, I just want to let y'all know. I was going to review this book a few months ago, but life happened and I just didn't want to refresh on this book because I just wanted to read other things. So now it's time to finally get to this, and I noticed some things that I didn't even notice a few months ago that are now even bigger negatives. This book is just a really frustrating read, if I'm being honest. Just a lot of things I just don't like, and I'll get into that near the end of the video. But, there are some fans of this book out there. I'm not trying to alienate people when I make this review. We're getting to the point of the channel where I'm starting to review more popular books and stuff. So if I don't like something, don't take what I'm saying as, me slandering a book or anything. Goosebumps is a, unique franchise where one book feels different than the other, and people like books for their own reasons. And I say this all the time. Goosebumps is like a buffet, right? You can go to a buffet and get whatever you like, but you don't have to get every single thing, and you don't have to like every single thing, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just not a fan of this. So, will it get a recommend from me? Probably not. But let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, this story starts off with these two kids named Joe and Mindy. It's the beginning of summer vacation, or pretty much close to it. And for the first 4 chapters, I'm going to kind of summarize these first 4 because really, this is all that happens in them. The two kids are playing ping pong. Ping pong. For 4 chapters. And they're talking about summer vacation starting, and Joe brings up that there's this gardening competition where his father had won the year before with his famous tomatoes. And Joe kind of reveals that he's pretty much like a secret gardener. He loves gardening. He doesn't really make that known. That's one of his hobbies, and he bonds with his dad over that, which I thought was kind of touching. And this year, they're looking to win the next blue ribbon for their famous tomatoes. Meanwhile, their neighbor, Mr. McCall, who seems kind of like a rival to Joe's dad, is also doing the competition, and he is growing these melons called casabas. And his hope is to win, the competition. Now, what strikes me weird is that they live in northern Michigan, and I would imagine that they only have a brief window to do all of this, but I think that it's very, I don't know, it's very Charles Band-esque, the way this story's set up in the beginning, because Joe brings up these lawn ornaments, and you already know, by looking at the cover, knowing the title of the book, you know that lawn ornaments are going to be a thing in the story. And Joe's dad has this eclectic thing about lawn ornaments. And Joe talks about that in, to the reader. So, as Joe's talking about that in his monologue, and as the ping pong is being played, we meet a character named Moose, who's Mr. McCall's son. And Mr. McCall's son and Joe are best friends. And we see Mindy try to fetch a ping pong ball, and she can't find it, and she gets jump scared by Moose. And Moose wants to jump in and play, right? And Joe and Moose start playing ping pong, And one of the cringiest things I have ever read in Goosebumps happens, right? So he's playing ping pong and he swats a ping pong ball really hard and he's like, super moose, and like banging his chest like a gorilla, like a complete incel. Like, yeah, I'm just gonna say this before we go any further. Moose is cringe city at points in this book. Seriously, very cringy character. And to kind of paint the picture, Moose is kind of like a Francis from Fairly Odd Parents if he wasn't funny. So, yeah, there's that. So, they're playing ping pong, and Moose destroys a ping pong ball. It's a bunch of nonsense, talking about ping pong. And then they realize the dog Buster, where's Buster? They lost sight of him. He was down there. And they look outside the window where they're playing ping pong, and they see Buster out in the garden. Not their garden, but Mr. McCall's garden, potentially messing with his cassavas. So they all race out to the garden and try to catch Buster. And then we get to meet Mr. McCall, who shouts, "Get that dog away from my cassavas." And the dog, is guilty, and the kids have to, calm Mr. McCall down. And then we get to meet Joe's dad, who says that they'll keep the dog off the garden. And the two, you can tell, kind of have this rivalry going on. So they head back to the garden, their own garden, and Joe's dad's like, "Hey, we're going to go over to this lawn ornament store. I think it's called something Linda's. And you guys are going to come with me." And the kids are like, "No, can we at least drive there?" And his dad's like, "No, it's a nice day. We're going to walk." So they start walking, some mindless banter happens. Joe rubs his sweat on his sister's shirt. It's very weird. You'll see this about Joe. Joe's is kind of a big old dweeb throughout the story. So messing with his sister, that's kind of a running gag throughout this book. Mindy's easily pranked by Joe. So they end up at this lawn ornament shop, and they go walking around the lawn in the backyard where she keeps the lawn ornaments. And it seems like Joe and the lady are really good friends, or Joe's dad and the lady are good friends. So Joe and Mindy go around looking at lawn ornaments. They say, "Hey Dad, how about this deer?" And the dad spots these two lawn gnomes. And they're like, he's like, "I have to have these." So he goes inside and buys these lawn gnomes. And the kids are like, "These lawn gnomes are stupid." And Joe pulls a prank on Mindy with the lawn gnomes, pretending that he's being grabbed by them, and it gets Mindy again. Mindy's a good old gullible Mindy. And there's, remedial, just not nonsensical banter like that for pretty much for the first half of the book. So the father comes out, they grab the lawn gnomes, and they head home. And they bring the lawn gnomes, and they pass by Mr. McCall's house. He makes a snooty comment to Joe's dad about the lawn gnomes, like, "Oh, another lawn ornament, or two lawn ornaments, Joe." I mean, Joe's dad, wherever his name is. And they put the lawn gnomes in the yard. And Moose sees these lawn gnomes and wants to come over and check them out. And immediately they're like, "Hey, let's mess with these lawn gnomes." They're like kicking it, throwing rings on it and whatnot. And then one of the lawn gnomes accidentally falls over. Now, these two lawn gnomes were given names. One's called Hap and one's called Chip. Hap is the one with a big old grin on his face, and Chip is one with a grin on his face, but he has a chipped tooth. So one of them falls over in the dirt. They worry that it's broken, but it's fine. And the kids are like, "Maybe we should be careful around these lawn gnomes." Well, let's just say, there's another cringy moment with Moose. And there's another altercation with Joe's father and Mr. McCall. So, pretty much after that, the next day comes around. And something happens in Mr. McCall's garden. Mr. McCall's crying out that something destroyed his cassavas. And it looks like it has been eaten. And Moose looks kind of upset as well. And Joe's like, "Well, who could have done this?" And of course Buster, the dog, gets blamed, and Buster now has to get chained up for a while until at least the gardening competition. So Joe feels bad about the dog, and when he's about to go get the dog to chain him up, he looks over at the mouth of the lawn gnome and sees a seed in its mouth, in one of their mouths, and he's like, "Well, that's weird." And he calls over Moose, and he's like, "Hey, does this look like a cassava seed to you?" And he's like, "It looks like a seed." And he's like, "Well, how did a seed get in its mouth?" And he can't really put two and two together, but he thinks that something seems off. So, of course, he has to tie up Buster, and Buster hates being tied up, and, Joe feels bad. Well, later on that day, at night, Joe's in his room, and he hears the dog whimpering. So he's like, well, I'm going to try to sneak out, but I don't want to get caught, because if I sneak out, I'm going to get in trouble or possibly grounded. So he goes downstairs, and he sees his sister Mindy. And Mindy is like, where are you going? And he's like, you know what? I'm going to go destroy Mr. the rest of his cassavas, because, he's a big jerk. Mindy's like, you wouldn't do that. And he's like, oh, I am. And Mindy's like, whatever, quit joking around. And she goes back upstairs. But Joe goes outside to check on his dog. And the dog seems to be okay, but then he hears rustling and, scraping sounds on the side of his house. And he's like, oh, something's wrong here. Well, the next day comes around after he checks on not Moose, Buster. Next day comes around and Mr. McCall's screaming, what happened to my cassavas? He's holding all four of his cassavas. They have been pulled, not from their vines, but they've been pulled out significantly. And something or someone had, put paint and drew, smirk faces all over these cassavas. And Mr. McCall has had it. And he's like, someone did this. It's your son. And he's talking to Joe's dad. And, of course, everybody's like, well, Joe didn't really do that. And then Mindy's like, no, Joe did do that. And she tells on him. And Joe's upset that he's being told on. And he knows that he didn't do this. Somebody's framing him. Something's doing this. And he looks over at the lawn gnomes as he's paint on its fingers. And he's like, he starts to put two and two together after he gets grounded by his dad for 2 weeks, at the beginning of summer vacation. He's like telling people, oh, look, the lawn gnomes have paint on its fingers. And he grabs his mom, and his mom's like, that's just dirt. Quit playing with us. And the reason why there's paint involved is because Joe's house is going to get repainted during the summer. His dad wants to repaint the house for some reason. Another thing of mindless banter. So now he's trying to convince his sister. And his sister's laughing. He's like, come on, Joe, you did it. And he's like, no, you got to believe me. And the story kind of starts with the you got to believe me stuff. And then Mindy kind of scolds him, makes fun of him and stuff. And Joe, being Joe, good old Joe, while he's grounded, goes into her room and disorganizes her clothes and pulls pranks on her. Typical Joe stuff. He doesn't really learn from being grounded. But then again, he didn't really do anything wrong. But, you really feel no sympathy for the kid because he's just a big dweeb and a jerk. But you kind of feel, a little sorry for him. Like, you shouldn't be going through this. So, he has nobody that will believe him. His dad has had enough with him, and his mom won't listen, and nobody seems to believe him. So, he recruits his friend Moose. And he's like, Moose, would you believe me if I told you that these gnomes are real and come to, possibly are doing this? And he's like, I don't know. And we'll put a pin in Moose, right? So Joe, it's foggy one night, and he decides to go out, and he's, looking outside, and he sees the lawn gnomes are missing. So he's like, where did they go? He's like, they must be somewhere. So he goes outside, and let's just say he discovers something. It's Moose. Moose is outside too. And then there's a whole scene where he tries to pin him down and give him a nipple twister, and good old cringy Moose. And they get a lot of attention. They're screaming outside. And of course, people come out. Mr. McCall and Joe's dad. And they're like, okay, you boys, come inside. You shouldn't be outside. You're already grounded. And he's like, well, we heard the lawn gnomes are missing. And Joe is pestering his dad. He's like, look, you got to believe me. The lawn gnomes aren't where they're supposed to be. Go look. So Joe's dad goes and looks. He doesn't see the lawn gnomes. He seems like he believes them a little bit. But then the fog kind of moves out the way, and then he sees the lawn gnomes there. And he says, for the final time, Joe, you need to quit with this lawn gnome stuff. It's not funny. Nobody's getting a kick out of it. And it's getting really bad. Well, another thing happens. The next day, or really close after this, Joe's dad's tomatoes, his famous tomatoes, have now been smashed. And his dad is super upset. He goes and confronts Mr. McCall. And Mr. McCall tells him, oh, his son must have did it. So now Joe is upset, and he has to figure out who's doing this, because he's not doing it, and he's sure that Moose isn't doing it. So he wants to see if the lawn gnomes are potentially the ones that are doing this. And there's also a couple scenes that kind of hint to Joe throughout the book, various, where he thinks he hears whispering to him, and the lawn gnomes are changing their face every time Buster's around. And there's a mechanism I haven't brought up yet, but he has his dog whistle that he blows to get Buster's attention. And it seems like every time Buster's around and he blows the whistle, the lawn gnomes kind of change their faces. And there's a couple scenes throughout the book as well where he's trying to tell people, hey, look, their expressions change and stuff. So there's that. But essentially, it all boils down to this argument, and the two are, at each other. And then another event happens where there's paint on, Mr. McCall's Jeep one night. And that's where the story gets kind of interesting. So, Mr. McCall gets, he had parked his Jeep outside, and there's, paint all over the Jeep, and Moose looks like, oh, he's already upset, and they follow this trail of white paint over to the lawn gnomes, and they're like, look, and Joe's like, look, I'm telling you, the lawn gnomes did this. Meet me tonight. We're going to catch these lawn gnomes in the act. And Moose is like, you're crazy. And Joe's like, you trust me, right? Moose is like, okay. So they meet up late at night after everybody goes to bed. And they park themselves in the bushes. And they're keeping an eye on the lawn gnomes for about 2 hours. Nothing's happening. But then they see them come to life. And Joe and Moose are awestruck that this is going on. And the lawn gnomes proceed to go over and take paint, particularly the same paint that possibly was graffitiing Mr. McCall's car, and takes black paint and throws it all over the house, Joe's family's house. And they're like, we got to stop these gnomes. And they're like, well, what are we going to do? I mean, we can't do anything. And then they're making a commotion, and then Mindy comes out after they get the attention of the lawn gnomes and are trying to run from them. And Mindy gets pretty much taken by the lawn gnomes, and they drag her out to the street. And Joe and Moose follow them, and then they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. The lawn gnomes are like, you have to, we come in peace. We come from a faraway land and in the forest. You have to understand, we're called mischief elves. Our job and our life's purpose is to do mischief. We just want to be sent to a faraway forest and live our lives peacefully outside of the realm of humans, so we don't bother them. But you have to do us a favor. We need you to go back to this ornament house. In this woman's basement, there's 6 other lawn gnomes we need to rescue, and then we can leave and never bother you again. So the kids kind of are shaking their heads. They really don't want to go through with this, but they decide why not. And Mindy and Joe are like, well, that way, if we get rid of these lawn gnomes, maybe we can free Buster, because, all these terrible things keep happening with these lawn gnomes. So they go to the woman's house that sells the lawn ornaments, and they go into the basement. They help break into the basement through a window. And all 3 of the kids and, Hap and Chip go into the basement. And a light turns on, and there's 600 lawn gnomes there. And they reveal to the kids that it was all a prank. It's all a joke. But now, since they're there, they're going to do things to them. They're going to tickle them. They're going to use them as a trampoline. They're going to bounce on them. They're going to play tug of war with them. Stuff like that. And that sounds kind of, for a kid's horror book, that's kind of creepy. You walk into an ambush of lawn gnomes. That's actually pretty scary, right? So the kids are like, oh no, this is terrible. Like, what are we going to do? And all these lawn gnomes, keep talking about, they're trying to take a vote on what to do with the kids. Do they want to fold them, play origami with them? and they act like they've already done this to kids before. So, yeah, this was pretty good. And then they hear Buster outside, and Buster, they're trying to get Buster's attention to get him through the window, and he's just not having. He's just kind of trotting along, and he just doesn't want to come in. So Joe gets this bright idea to blow the dog whistle. And essentially, the lawn gnomes understand, like, oh, there's something about the dog whistle they don't like. So Hap and Chip try to snatch it from them, and there's this whole ordeal of the dog whistle getting freed. But Joe manages to get the dog whistle, and in a nick of time, blows it. Now, something may or may not happen. I'm not going to spoil any part of this. But he blows a dog whistle, and something may or may not happen. And that's essentially, like, near the end of the climax of the book. And then by the end, there's an ending where things, go into the next day, and there's really some other things not really paid off, and there might be a new lawn ornament that Joe's dad has gotten, and let's just leave it at that. So that's essentially Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, y'all. So, yeah, this book, y'all, I'm trying really hard to pull some positives out of it, because I do think I have positives with it. For how meandering this book is, and just how banter-filled and really pointless this book really was in totality, and how unresolved the main core of the story was. I think the story was well written in terms of action with Joe's monologue. Joe's not the greatest character, but he did have a monologue going, and the story did have enough going on to keep the story going. So it made it kind of like a brisk pace read, which I quite enjoyed, even though I was really cringing hard at some characters and questioning some logic issues, like some very, very brazen logic issues that cringing at some "you gotta believe me," cringing at some unresolved issues. But for the most part, the writing for what was there was on the more good side. I like the Lawn Gnomes. For better or for worse, I think what makes this book what it is the Lawn Gnomes. Yeah, it takes quite a long time to get to the Lawn Gnomes in the book when we finally meet them. But the Lawn Gnomes definitely made the book somewhat enjoyable for me. And, yeah, that's about it. That's about it. Negatives, y'all. Negatives. Okay, it might seem like I'm about to beat this book up. And I am. But just know that it's in good hearts, okay? So, one of the first negatives I noticed off the bat is that the first 4 chapters of this book is about ping pong and setting up this garden competition with Joe's dad and Mr. McCall. So, the ping pong aspect is just completely nonsensical. And the extended background into Mr. McCall and Joe's dad's rivalry is okay to start the book off with. But it just kind of hobbles and meanders around. Not to mention, when Moose comes into the story, I have never cringed harder in my life to a Goosebumps character. Moose, to me, he represents all of the cringy middle school kids you see in like movies like Diary of the Wimpy Kid, stuff like that. There's always at least one cringy kid. And Moose is that kid. He has some of the cringiest things. He's like Super Moose banging a ping pong ball, thinking it's cool, trying to hold Joe down throughout the book, trying to give him a nipple twister, and just really random stuff that he does and says. It's just really cringe. Like, I'm not a fan of Moose. Even though Moose kind of gets better throughout the story, and I liked him getting scared by the lawn gnomes. That was really fun. But yeah, Moose is a dud. And the first 4 chapters being essentially about ping pong and this overly drawn out thing. The book should have started on chapter 5. That you really could have just saved parts of the rivalry thing and just put it at the beginning of chapter 5, and you would have been fine. Joe, okay, let's get into Joe. Joe and Mindy are both negatives for me here. For Mindy, right? Mindy, she's easily pranked throughout the story, and it's so annoying watching her fall for Joe's tricks all the time in the book. It's so annoying. But she does make a fun joke when Joe's grounded, and she wants to go out to the pool with her friend. He says, "Oh, but you can't go because you're grounded." That was probably the funniest joke in the whole book from any of the kids, to be honest. Because Joe deserved that. And then Joe. Joe, he has a monologue in his book, in this book, right? Joe and his friend Moose are just two total dweebs and jerks, and they do really cringy things. Joe kind of considers himself a cool kid, and then he goes, but he gardens. Like, what kind of kid gardens, okay? I'm not trying to knock kids or people out there into gardening. I'm not, okay? But Joe, I think low-key is a poser, all right? He's a little garden freak. He loves gardening. He's into weird stuff. But then he tries to come off like a cool kid. And you see kind of holes in his character as the story goes on when he tries to act all tough. But then, instead of acting tough and solving things on his own, he goes and cries to his parents, even though in the book he understands, right? He understands. I'll give him some credit. That if he keeps going to his parents, they're not going to believe him about what's going on with the lawn gnomes. So he's going to get blamed for this or keep getting more in trouble. But he still goes to them and cries to them, "Hey, you got to believe me." He doesn't take action until it's way too late for him, almost. And I'm just like, you know what, Joe? I appreciate your monologue, but you're just a straight up poser, y'all. For real. Joe is all talk, right? And he's obviously the beta in that Moose-Joe relationship. Yeah, you can clearly tell that dynamic. And Moose is not the brightest bulb in the box. So reading about these kids was really... you almost had to turn off your brain cells a little bit. It was bad. So, yeah. And then, okay. The majority of the book, right? The core point of this story is that there's a competition with Mr. McCall and Joe's father. And you're expecting to see payoff with this. There is absolutely no payoff with the contest whatsoever in the book. You never get to see what happens in the contest. You never get to see what happens as a result of the graffiti on the Jeep or the paint on the house either. That never gets resolved in the story. So I'm like, well, what comes of this stuff? It really just feels like scenes that don't matter. And it really frustrates me, especially by the end. It's really annoying. Majority of the book is about this banter. It gets really boring, kind of snooze fest-ish. And then you get into the "you gotta believe me" with Joe that just puts the icing on top. And then we don't get to see the lawn gnomes do anything. This book is 119 pages. The lawn gnomes do not come to life until about page 86. And it wouldn't be that bad, right? If the story wasn't obviously already pointing towards this reveal that the lawn gnomes are the ones behind these pranks. There needed to be a better mystery element to this. There needed to be more stakes with this garden competition. I feel like the book focused all of its attention on this banter, which is the total wrong area. You actually have to build plot here. You actually have to build some sort of core backbone to a story. In this book, things just happen. And yeah, while the vibe is cool, while it feels kind of, John Waters-esque with, a hint of Charles Band from Full Moon Features, you have this weird vibe, northern Minnesota. You got these two families living next door with no fence, so they share a yard almost, and they're into gardening. It's a very weird and different feeling book. It has that summertime atmosphere, but you can't enjoy it when there's no plot that go into it. It's just a bunch of random stuff happening. And let's get to the ending now. The ending, I'm not a fan of, because it literally just, it's like a, here you go, here's a twist. R.L. Stine. Why he thought this was a good twist, how he thought this was a good twist, is beyond me. You have all these animals, all these other lawn ornaments on Joe's dad's lawn, and he goes and gets one. The only things we know in the story to come to life are lawn gnomes, and you get a twist like that. I'm not going to spoil what it is. I might have given you a little hint there, but it is just why. It's a confusing twist. Sorry, I had to go off on this book a little bit. So yeah, you know, from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'm not gonna lie, y'all. This book, fundamentally, I mean, it has good writing elements in it. It has good like villain characters, but everything else about it is just really frustrating and annoying, kind of cringy, kind of dull. The logic is missing, and if the book focuses in the wrong areas, and with all those negatives mentioned, I collectively, you know, I don't mean to sound so harsh on this, but I'm giving this book a 2.5 out of 5, and I deducted 2.5 off the top. Here's why. I just think this book, it could have been way better than it was, but there's no payoff at the core of the story, and if it had at least had that, I probably would have given this book a low D. But I'm giving this book a low D minus. It's on the cusp of being just bad or being terrible. It's kind of like in between a bad and a terrible book to me. Minus the villains, I think the Lawn Gnomes really saved this book, honestly. And some of the writing does make it more easier to read, but not a fan of this one, y'all. So yeah, it gets a low D minus for me. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. Let me know down in the comment section. Do you love this book or do you hate this book? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.